From Japan, and today I am going to present our ongoing projects on the early Dilmun burial mounds with Dr. Masashi Abe. So we have been running two projects in Bahrain, and one of them is the excavations at Wadi and the other is a mapping project for documenting large-scale burial mound sites of the period, of the early Dilmun period, which is called the Dilmun Mapping Project. So before going into our presentation, I would like to express our gratitude to the Musée de Louvre for inviting us to this invaluable opportunity. And we are also thankful to Sheikh Hamai, Sheikh Khalifa al-Khalifa, Dr. Pierre Lombard, and Dr. Salman al-Mahari of the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities for their continuous support to our projects. And we are also thankful to the Mr. Kiyohide Saito and Professor Sumio Fuji, for their support to our project. So the Japanese contributions to the archaeology of Bahrain started in the late 1980s by the excavations at the burial mound site of Buri, followed by the excavations at the temple site of Ain Sujur. So after the gap of 20 years, the Japanese mission led by Dr. Goto and Saito started excavations at Wadi Asel, it's an early Dilmun burial mound site, in 2015. So since then, we have been continuing the projects at Wadi Asel, and we set up a new project called Dilmun Mapping Project in 2020 to document large-scale burial mound sites of the early Dilmun period. So this presentation gives a summary of our projects and results. So first, I am going to talk about the Dilmun Mapping Project. For the project I am doing, I am in the position of the project leader. So actually, this Dilmun Mapping Project aims at documenting large-scale burial mound sites of the early Dilmun period, and most of which were inscribed as the World Heritage List in 2019. So actually, recent developments of digital technology have revolutionized archaeological research. The photogrammetric 3D modeling technology using a drone enables us to create high-resolution 3D model of extensive archaeological sites. So the Dilmun Mapping Project, in collaboration with BACA, has been documenting large-scale burial mound sites in Bahrain using this technology. So the 3D models created made it possible to analyze various attributes, morphological, dimensional, and spatial, etc., that have not ever been discussed so much. Okay. So the image, to the left, is from my own project as a site of Kraya in the northwestern part of Saudi Arabia. So it is a large-scale urban settlement of the Bronze Age. This one, this one. So, this site is surrounded by a fortification wall, and it has an area of more than 300 hectares. So it's a very huge site. But actually, in collaboration with a team from Department of Prehistoric and Historical Archaeology, the University of Vienna, led by Dr. Marta Luciani, my mapping project has successfully documented various features constituting this urban settlement. The site is surrounded by walls, as I told you, and the area of the walled area is more than 300 hectares. So only the digital technology made it possible to document such a large-scale site in an extremely high resolution. So this slide shows you the outline of the early Dilmun period in Bahrain. So the early Dilmun period is contemporary with different ancient civilizations in southwestern Asia. In Mesopotamia, the Akkad dynasty, the third dynasty of Ur, and Isin-Larsa dynasties belong to the same time period as the early Dilmun period. And in the northwestern part of South Asia, the Indus civilization developed during this period. So the early Dilmun period is one of the most significant phases in the history of the Bahrain island, as attested well by the construction of a large, great number of burial mounds. So during this period, the island was connected to the different parts of southwestern Asia, including Mesopotamia, Iran, and the Indus Valley. So seals, stone beads, and ceramics from the excavations of burial mounds are the testimony to the social-cultural transformation happening on the island. So, I mean, in this map, you can see the distribution of burial mound sites, I mean, along the central hill in the island. And this photo is from the aerial survey, which took place in the 1959. So you can see a number of burial mound sites. And this photo is from my own project. And this is a seal with Indus script and Indus iconography. But this was made in the Bahrain island. And this is a pottery from Mesopotamia. And this is a chronological chart of the early Dilmun period. So in the northern part of the island, I mean, there are several large-scale burial mound sites, I mean, as I showed you on this map. And most of them are located on the gentle slope of the hills in the central part of the island. So until the 1970s, more than 70,000 burial mounds of the early Dilmun period were preserved in these sites. But unfortunately, after the 1970s, the large-scale land developments unfortunately destroyed a number of burial mounds and have modified the early Dilmun landscape quite considerably. So, however, the large-scale burial mound sites, which are still preserved and inscribed in the World Heritage List, provide us with a number of information and clues on the ancient landscape of the island. So the site of Wadi belongs to the early phase of the early Dilmun period, I mean the late 3rd millennium BCE. So there were some other sites, I mean dating to the same period before, but now only this site is preserved for representing this time period. So compared to the examples of the late phase of the early Dilmun period, several differences can be pointed out regarding the locations, distribution patterns, morphological features of the burial mounds. For the locations, the burial mounds at this site are situated on the slopes of either side of Wadi. So here is a Wadi, and you can see a number of burial mounds on this side. So the locations of large mounds at higher resolution is likely to exhibit the ancient people used higher locations for elites or ancestors. So you can see some largest mounds, I mean, on the top of the slope. For the distribution patterns, the density of burial mounds is considerably lower than the case of the late phase of the early Dilmun period of the 2nd millennium BCE. Several mounds were constructed in the linear pattern along or across the slope. So you can see some, linear arrangements of burial mounds here and there. So it may indicate that the linear cluster belongs to some social groups, such as kinship groups and socially stratified groups. For the morphology of mounds, the mounds at this site are remarkably lower compared to the examples from the late phase. So this is a profile of the mounds from Wadi Asel. And you can see a higher mound, I mean, from the late phase of the early Dilmun period. So this is because the chambers were smaller and the mound were exclusively built with stones. But the mounds of the late phase has larger chambers and were built with a mixture of stones and sand. So that makes a difference between the, in the morphology between the early phase and late phase of the early Dilmun period. So this one. And this is an example from Ari, one of the components of the World Heritage Site. The site generally belongs to the late phase of the early Dilmun period. So you can see a huge number of burial mounds, I mean, on either side of the highway. Compared to the case of Wadi Asel, the density of mound is extremely higher on the gentle and flat slope, and the mounds become higher. The presence of extra-large mounds called the Royal Burial Mound is also noteworthy for this site. So you can see the very huge burial mounds, I mean, on the north edge of the site, and this is, the larger view of the royal mounds at this site. So, I mean, in this map, you can see a huge number of burial mounds of smaller and medium-sized. And this is a picture of the royal mounds. So when you look at the burial mounds closely, you can notice that the lower mounds of the early phase and the higher mounds of the later phase are interminglingly distributed in the site. So, I mean, there are some lower mounds, I mean, here and there, and they were surrounded by a higher mound of the late phase of the early Dilmun period. So it indicates that people started constructing burial mounds towards the end of the third millennium at this site, and then the graveyard was expanded greatly with constructing a great number of burial mounds along with extra-large mounds during the late phase. The large and extra-large mounds tend to cluster in the northern part of the site, that is a flat area of lower elevation. So, I mean, here is a cluster of the extra-large burial mound, and you can find some large mounds at this, in a line on the edge of on the northern edge of the site. So, actually, therefore, I mean, it can be presumed that the spatial distribution pattern or the use of space was dramatically changed between the early and the late phases of the early Dilmun period. So this change in the distribution pattern may have been connected to the social transformation from a relatively smaller community of the third millennium to a highly organized kingdom of the second millennium. And this is another example from Kazakhstan. So this site is situated on a gentle slope to the west of Wadi Asel. Interestingly, the southeastern part of this site, which is higher in elevation, so this part is higher, and this part is lower in elevation. So actually, I mean, in southeastern part of this site, which is higher in elevation and divided by deeper wadis. I mean, you can see the wadis here, and they divide the burial mounds. So, I mean, it is very distinct in having a relative sparse distribution of mounds. The mounds in this part are arranged in a linear pattern, similar to the case at Wadi Asel. The shapes of mounds are also similar to the examples from Wadi Asel. So, I mean, that indicates the burial mounds in this part belong to the early phase of this site. In contrast, the rest of the site, which are lower in elevation and flatter, is occupied by a dense distribution of mounds. It means that the construction of mounds started in the southeastern parts and expanded towards west. So, I mean, you can see a huge number of burial mounds of the late phase of the early Dilmun period. And while most of the burial mounds are already gone, but large mounds are found in the lowest level of the site in the west. So you can see a large burial mound site, in this part. So their arrangements are identical with the case of early. It means that the changes of the spatial distribution pattern during the late phase of the early Dilmun period was widely happening not only in particular site, but also across the northern part of the island. So as a conclusion for my part, it can be stressed out that the digital technology has been dramatically changing our perceptions and perspectives of archaeological sites, especially for large-scale sites like burial mound sites in Bahrain. So the digital terrain model obtained from our mapping project can provide a great amount of information to our understanding of the developmental process of burial mound sites, which were essential part of the ancient landscape of this island. So specifically, it is important to remember that the early and the late phases of the early Dilmun period considerably differ from each other in the social, cultural, apparatus, such as the emergence of cities, temples, seals, etc. So the burial mound sites also exhibit drastic changes between the two phases. So further research on burial mounds definitely reveal important facts and provide information and insights about the early Dilmun period.
So the next, I would like to introduce Wadi al-Sair archaeological project. So before introducing our project, so let me explain the chronology of early Dilmun period again. Early Dilmun period is divided into two phases, early phase and late phase. Early phase is dated to between 2300 BC and 2050 BC. Before early Dilmun period, Bahrain was only sparsely populated. But during the early phase of early Dilmun period, a large-scale immigration into Bahrain took place. Immigrants, they created villages and started construction of burial mounds. However, maritime trade was still dominated by Mesopotamian polities, and Dilmun played a minor role in the maritime trade during the early phase. The late phase is dated to between 2050 BC and 1700 BC. During the late phase, Dilmun dominated the maritime trade, linking Mesopotamia, Oman, and Indus. As Dr. Uesugi already argued, Dilmun societies rapidly developed and walled city, large public temples, and gigantic royal tombs were constructed. However, Dilmun society suddenly collapsed around 1700 BC. In the early Dilmun period, a total of 75,000 burial mounds were constructed in Bahrain. So black areas shows the distribution of burial mounds of the later phase, and dark gray areas show the original distribution of burial mounds of early phase. Burial mounds of early phase used to widely distributed. However, most of the burial mounds of the early phase were lost due to urban development. Currently, burial mounds of early phase remain only around Wadi al-Sair. So Wadi al-Sair is a 4-kilometer-long wadi running from southeast to northwest on the inland plateau of Bahrain. So along the upper stream of the wadi, hundreds of burial mounds are scattered on both slopes of the wadi. So this picture was taken from the bottom of the wadi. As you can see, burial mounds are thinly scattered on a slope of the wadi. The low density of the burial mounds is one of the characteristics of burial mounds of early phase. So Wadi al-Sair is a very huge site. So our research focuses on its northeastern part. Even in this part, there are about 270 burial mounds. Black dots represent burial mounds. So in 2014, we started our project, and we have done 6 seasons of excavations and excavated a total of 31 burial mounds. So burial mounds at Wadi al-Sair are built of stones, an oval burial chamber, and outer wall were initially constructed, and then the space between them was filled with stones. So this is a picture of typical burial chamber. The long axis of the burial chamber is usually east-west. One person was buried in one burial chamber, in one burial mound. The dead was usually buried in a crouching position with facing to the north. The head usually points to the east. Partially bound sheep bones are often found in front of the knees of the skeleton. So these are grave goods excavated from burial chambers. They include, faience beads from the Indus, and some carnelian beads from Indus, and pottery from Oman and Mesopotamia. So it is generally believed jars from Mesopotamia originally contained perfume oils. Shells containing cosmetic pigments are also often found. The pigments were used for eyeshadow. So the next I would like to talk about hierarchy of the burial mounds. Compared with the later phase, hierarchy of burial mounds was less developed during the early phase. However, burial mounds of the early phase also show some degree of hierarchy. The burial mounds at Wadi al-Sair can be divided into three types: ordinary burial mounds, large burial mounds, and ring burial mounds. So this is a picture of typical ordinary burial mounds. The ordinary burial mounds are small and range between 5 meters and 7 meters in diameter. But there are few large burial mounds. Of 270 burial mounds, 3 burial mounds are larger than 10 meters in diameter. So in addition, the ordinary burial mounds and large burial mounds are situated in different places. So ordinary burial mounds are located on the slope of the wadi, while large burial mounds are placed on the top of the slope, from where they have a good view of the wadi. So one of the large burial mounds is even encircled with a ring wall. This mound was excavated by a Danish team. Such mounds are called ring burial mounds. The ring burial mounds are interpreted as burials of incipient Dilmun leaders. So I just explained Wadi al-Sair briefly. I think Wadi al-Sair is a very important site to consider the origins of Dilmun. As I mentioned before early Dilmun period, Bahrain was only sparsely populated, and during the early phase of early Dilmun period, a large immigration to Bahrain took place. So they settled down in Bahrain and created villages. They also started construction of burial mounds, and Wadi al-Sair was created. So where did they come from? Some argue they were from Oman Peninsula, and others argue they were from Tylos Island. But these ideas are not acceptable because burial traditions in Tylos Island and Oman Peninsula are totally different from burial traditions in Bahrain. So burial mound fields, which are very similar to Wadi al-Sair, are widely distributed this area. They are widely distributed across the inner desert, including Syrian desert and North Arabian desert. So during the Bronze Age, pastoral nomadic groups called Amorites lived there. Amorites are pastoral nomadic groups mentioned in the ancient Mesopotamian text, and it is well known that in the late 3rd millennium BC, they left deserts and infiltrated into southern Mesopotamia. In the early 2nd millennium BC, Amorites seized the power and established their own dynasties in major cities such as Babylon and Larsa in southern Mesopotamia. And pastoral nomads in the deserts, they created a number of burial mound fields after 6000 BC. And they are very similar to Wadi al-Sair. For example, so this site is called Tala Davida. This is a Bronze Age burial mound field located in Jordanian desert. I excavated this burial mound 20 years ago. They are built of stones and has an oblong chamber in the center and outer wall surrounded, and space between them was filled with stones. Even the long axis of the chamber is east-west. So the construction method is the same as Wadi Said, and three-tiered hierarchy consisting of ordinary barrier mounds and large barrier mounds and ring barrier mounds also characterize barrier mound field in the desert. In addition, ring barrier mounds are also widely distributed in the inner desert. For example, in Palmyra in Syria, 3 ring barrier mounds were recently discovered on the top of Jabal Muhammad ibn Ali, which are located 10 kilometers to the north of Palmyra oasis. So, can you see? Yes. These ring barrier mounds are placed along on the hilltop and command good views of Palmyra oasis. These ring barrier mounds are large and the mounds are over 10 meters in diameter. The special location and large size suggest these are barriers of leaders of pastoral nomads who probably controlled the region near Palmyra. So we have additional archaeological evidence. So this is a rock art discovered in desert and show Bronze Age pastoral nomads. They have a very unique dagger. The pommel of the dagger is lunate-shaped, and this dagger was probably an important status symbol in desert during the Bronze Age. And this is a dagger excavated from one of the barrier mounds in Bahrain. As you can see, this dagger is very similar to the daggers depicted in the rock arts. The dagger demonstrates strong connection between Dilmun and desert. Further strong evidence was also recently discovered. Bahrain team, they excavated one of early Dilmun royal mounds, and Danish archaeologist Dr. Laursen accidentally discovered fragments of stone vessels. On 3 fragments, a Dilmun royal name was inscribed. This is the first discovery of Dilmun royal name from royal mounds. The king's name was Yagiri-il. This is a very important discovery because Yagiri-il is a typical Amorite name. So to conclude, evidence from Wadi Said and other evidence suggest Dilmun people probably originated from pastoral nomads, Amorites, who lived in the inner deserts. So this is the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.